What are you doing in my bedroom, comrade? It's 4 a.m. I said I would do what? Well, all right. I suppose the revolution never sleeps. Let me at least get dressed and we'll get on with it. Hello, Tovarish, and welcome to my channel. My name is V, like the letter. I'm a young leftist with an interest in history. Join me in exploring leftism, then and now, all around the world. Apologies for the time between the pilot of this channel and this upload. My comrade in arms and I have been in the process of moving kommunalkas, and it has been hectic. This morning, this early morning, we'll be reading the first chapter of the 1969 biographical novella, A Life Devoted to Struggle, commemorating the 100-year anniversary of the birth of Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya. This novel was written by Lyudmila Ivanovna Kunetskaya and Klara Alexandrovna Mashtakova. Very little is known about these women. If I overlooked something in my research of them, please inform me in the comments section. But I came up empty-handed. Krupskaya was a revolutionary that aided in the overthrowing of the Tsar and later became the Deputy Minister of Education after the Soviet Union was formed. By the way, the original price of my copy was 24 kopecks. Without further ado, pause the video to grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and let's get right into the reading. It begins with a quote from Comrade Nadezhda herself. It reads as follows: I am very happy that I managed to live through the revolution, and I love the work I am doing at present. My personal life was a very happy one, and if there are moments that are difficult to bear, well, who has not had such moments? I have lived an active life brimming with events. I have nothing to complain of. If I were to begin my life all over again, I would care to change very little in it, except for a few trifles, perhaps. Chapter 1: Russia's First Lady. Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya, the wife and companion in arms of V.I. Lenin, was, up to her very death, an outstanding public figure and stateswoman. She was a professional revolutionary, a pedagogue, a journalist, and deputy minister of the Department of Public Education. She was deeply loved and respected by all of her contemporaries. In 1934, 10 years after Lenin's death, Richard Halliburton, correspondent of the Pittsburgh Press, visited Moscow. Among the leading figures that Halliburton wished to meet, N.K. Krupskaya was the first he named. Here is an extract from an article sent to Nadezhda Konstantinovna in January 1935 through the Soviet Bureau of the International Miners Committee. This is how Richard Halliburton described his visit to Krupskaya. Quote, Moscow, USSR. Across the table from me, in her small but very busy office, sat the First Lady of the land of Russia. She was Citizen Krupskaya, widow of the great Lenin. Hers is the one name always mentioned by every Russian. greater tribute than this no woman has ever had. When I entered her office, she is one of the commissars, ministers of education. She sat, leaning on her desk, as if extremely tired. A black shawl held close about her shoulders, but snow-white hair falling in careless wisps about her strong but kindly face. Her weary lids were half closed. Here was a woman who had endured appalling suffering, who had fought, all the long life for what seemed to be, for the most of it, a hopeless dream. But when those eyes gave me a smiling welcome, that weary face seemed to spring to life. And when she spoke, 40 years vanished from her age. She spoke rapidly, vigorously. The clarity of her mind and the force of her character arrested me immediately, as they arrest everyone who comes in contact with this magnificent old lady. I understood why, as an orator and leader, she had been one of the greatest forces of the revolution. Even now, she speaks often at public gatherings and on the radio, and when she does, all of Russia listens. I was allowed to speak to Mrs. Lenin for an hour. Fortunately, she speaks English. Her great interest is the education and emancipation of women. In this respect, Citizen Krupskaya and her department have accomplished stupendous things. End quote. Pittsburgh Press, December 30th, 1934. One of the first interviews she ever gave was to an English journalist in 1920. Nadezhda Konstantinovna was accustomed to such interviews. She was often obliged to receive foreigners. He met Nadezhda Konstantinovna in the People's Commissariat of Education. At first, the journalist had difficulty in keeping up conversation as he tried to blend his own convictions with actuality. It seemed to him that the wife of the Prime Minister of one of the largest countries in the world was very shabbily dressed. She received him in a dark woolen frock, quite unadorned, and she wore very plain shoes. Her straight hair was done up in a simple bun. Her large, nearsighted eyes narrowed as she greeted him with a smile. Her English was perfect. She asked the correspondent what he had already seen in Russia and what he wanted to learn from her. As the interview progressed, the journalist no longer noticed the clothes this woman was wearing. In front of him was a dignified, clever, and learned representative of the ruling party of Russia. When one of his questions bordered on the naive, an ironical smile appeared on her face, and the intonation of the slightly muffled timbre of her voice showed indications of fatigue. She felt like telling her interviewer that it was high time to stop writing all that anti-Soviet rubbish. As late as 1920, were there no other way for correspondents to capture the interest of a bored public except with stories about bears and corpses lying around in the streets of Russian cities? But Lenin's wife did not ask these questions aloud. She answered all his questions patiently. Yes, just as her husband, she is convinced of the final victory of the revolution. Yes, the Russian people will withstand the hunger, intervention, and ruin, and will finally acquire a high level of world culture. Among the visitors to the museum study and apartment of V.I. Lenin in the Kremlin, there are many who knew Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya. They speak of her with profound respect. On the 4th of October, 1967, veterans of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany visited Lenin's Kremlin apartment. After the excursion was over, one of the group, Gertrude Busse, talked to the curator. "I am happy that I met Nadezhda Konstantinovna in the 30s, she said. "I am amazed at her appearance. She could very well have passed unnoticed in a crowd of working women or peasants in her plain frock and simply dressed hair. I clearly recall her warm and attentive gaze, the clear and comprehensive way she answered all my questions, and her unfeigned simplicity and sincerity." End quote. What sort of life had this woman led before she became Russia's First Lady? In a small article called My Life, Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya wrote, quote, "I was born in 1869. My parents, though of noble birth, had neither house nor home. Mother was an orphan. She studied on a scholarship and went to work as a governess straight from the institute. Father's parents died early, and he was educated at a military school and then at a military college, from which he graduated as an officer." End quote. N.K. Krupskaya. On education, Academy of Pedagogical Sciences Publishing House, Konstantin Ignatievich Krupsky was one of the circle of progressive, revolutionary Russian officers. In her childhood, little Nadezhda heard talks about the oppressed workers and peasants and the lack of political freedom. On graduation from the Military Academy of Law, K.I. Krupsky was assigned to an army administrative post in Poland. Here, he used every means to track down all the graft and bribery of the Russian bureaucratic administration. This won him the respect of the local Polish inhabitants, but earned him the profound hatred of his superiors. Anonymous reports led to his dismission without explanation. He was brought up for trial and deprived of the right to occupy a government position. Among the 22 charges that were brought against him were: speaks Polish, dances the mazurka, does not attend church, does not celebrate the Tsar's birthday with illuminations at the office, and so on. The investigation continued for 10 years, and he was finally acquitted by the Senate just before he died. During these 10 years, he worked from factory to factory and from estate to estate. And everywhere, little Nadezhda came up against the same wealth and the rule of might on the other. Her mother often told her about life as a governess among the landed gentry. These tales made a lasting impression on the sensitive girl. To the end of her days, she remembered how peasants once attacked the carriage in which she and her parents were returning from the landlords. They were nearly killed because the peasants took them for members of the gentry. The father did not blame the peasants, because he well understood their hatred for the landlords. At the age of 11, the girl met a village school teacher who had devoted her life to the education of the peasants. She also spoke about the injustices of the existing order, and when the teacher was arrested, Nadezhda vowed to continue her footsteps when she grew up. At the age of 14, she lost her father. She had to earn a living and did so by giving private lessons to children of well-to-do families. On graduating from a gymnasium, Krupskaya tried to become a school teacher, but to no avail. About this time, she faced the problem of what to do next, of how to serve her people. She was very fond of Leo Tolstoy's works, and for a time became an exponent of his theory of self-improvement. She even wrote a letter to Tolstoy in reply to his appeal to girls who had graduated from gymnasiums to put their knowledge to good use by rewriting books for the people in simple language they would understand. In her letter, Nadezhda Konstantinovna said, quote, "I know that simplifying books so they could be read by the people is a serious matter demanding much skill and knowledge, but I am only 18 and know so very little." End quote. N.K. Krupskaya. On Education, Academy of Pedagogical Sciences, Publishing House. The great writer sent her an answer, and Alexander Dumas, Le Comte de Monte Cristo, for such processing. Nadezhda Konstantinovna undertook the work with zeal. Later, she often recalled this work. The finished work she sent to Yasnaya Polyana. Unfortunately, Tolstoy's second reply has been lost, but under the influence of his theory of self-improvement, she left for the village, where she worked on a par with the peasants. However, it soon became clear to her that the world would change little from her personal self-improvement. And, quote, "Injustices would continue to exist no matter how much I strive. True, I learned more about peasant life, learned how to talk to peasants and workers, but what was the good of it all?" End quote. Ibid. In those days, women were not accepted in schools of higher learning in Russia. Nadezhda Konstantinovna diligently worked at her own education. Immediately, higher courses for women were organized in St. Petersburg. She enrolled, but soon saw that the subjects there were too abstract and far removed from everyday life. Then she entered a student circle and began studying Marx. Quote, "Marxism," wrote Krupskaya in 1932, "afforded me the greatest happiness that a human being can wish for, knowledge of what path to follow, and confidence in the final result of the cause to which one has devoted one's life. The path was not always easy, but there was never any doubt that it was not the right path." End quote. Like all active natures, Krupskaya was not satisfied with the knowledge she had acquired. She had to put it to immediate use. So Nadezhda Konstantinovna began working as a teacher in a St. Petersburg Sunday evening school for workers on the outskirts of the city. Twice a week and on Sundays, about 1,000 workers from the neighboring factories and plants attended this school. They were people of various crafts, all former peasants. The aim of the school was to provide the workers with elementary education. Krupskaya never forgot her first pupils. Her contacts with the workers soon became so friendly that their political education became possible. The teachers in the Sunday evening school worked without pay. They were remarkable people, a whole galaxy of selfless educators, many of whom later became members of the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. On Sundays, poetry and prose readings were held in the school. On Krupskaya's suggestion, these were occasionally replaced by stories about other lands and peoples. These sessions were very popular with the workers. Krupskaya's pupils included well-known worker revolutionaries, Ivan Babushkin, Arseny, and Philip Bodrov. Later, it became known that they had simultaneously attended a Marxist group led by Lenin. Krupskaya learned about the life of the workers. She visited their homes and helped them to write and distribute leaflets at the factories and plants, calling for the overthrow of Tsarism. When Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya met Lenin, she was already a full-fledged revolutionary of the Marxist school, with extensive experience in underground work and ties not only among the intelligentsia, but also among the workers. She was one of the leading and most active members of the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, founded by Lenin in 1893. When he went abroad in 1895, Lenin, with the agreement of his comrades, left all the links and secret codes with Krupskaya, considering her the most reliable. The first issue of the magazine, Rabocheye Delo, Workers' Cause, was discussed at her house several days before the arrest of most of the leaders of the Union for the Struggle. After the arrest in 1896 and exile, which Krupskaya shared with Lenin in Siberia, she emigrated in 1901. She took an active part in the publication of the Bolshevist underground newspaper, Iskra, Spark. She also worked as a secretary of the party newspapers, Period, Forward, and Proletary, which were published abroad and distributed illegally in Russia. She conducted extensive party correspondence, and in 1915 was a delegate to the International Women's Conference at Bern. After returning to Russia in April 1917 with Lenin, Krupskaya actively participated in the preparation and launching of the Great October Socialist Revolution. After the triumph of the Proletarian Revolution, she devoted herself wholeheartedly to the education to the working masses. This concludes the first chapter of a life devoted to struggle. Hopefully, this gave you a little insight into the early years of Russia's First Lady. Something that stood out to me upon my first read-through of this novella was just how relatable Krupskaya is to the modern leftist. Not only that, but any leftist with a decent education is capable of starting their careers the way that she has. The part where she wrote to Tolstoy, saying she was so young and didn't know much at all, and his reply, mailing her a classic novel, touched me enough that I started this channel in honor of her, hoping I can be just a drop in the bucket she molded. The way she grows exhausted with higher education for being too abstract, and her frustration from self-improvement, not fixing her material conditions, are things many of us can relate to, especially now. Nowadays, we would probably call her a doomer. I'm sure many of us don't see much of a future for our movement at this time. It is pretty grim to turn on a screen and read just about anything these days. Don't lose hope, comrade. If Krupskaya and Lenin could start a country from peasants, they personally taught to understand the value of learning, then not all is lost for us either. And if, in 60 years, the Soviet Union could transition from feudalism to the space age, then things are truly not so grim after all. We simply must play the long game, comrades, and learn our history. Next time, we will be reading Chapter 2, More Than Her Share of Work. With that, I bid you farewell, fellow laborer, and my dear Tovarish. Until we meet again. Until then, do skorovo, comrades, and may peace be with you.
Но только смерть не для меня,